Hello, welcome to this webinar. It's connected with the project where we look to family rights and protecting women. It's the last webinar in the project, and I invite you to follow activities on the Western and the Dream site because there will be follow-up. But this is our last webinar in this first phase of the project. So for this last webinar, we have Professors Elizabeth and this is called High Conflict Separation and Domestic Violence, Seeing Things a Little Bit More Clearly. Now, just before we more officially begin the webinar, I'd like to remind you that I am currently on unceded Indigenous territory, and it's important to think about this. Just a couple days past the 30th of September, so the day recognizing truth and reconciliation. And I think it's important to have this thought, and sometimes we can say this sort of sentence at the beginning of a presentation, but it's important to give some thought to it and understand what it means to us and to others so that we can all participate in this reconciliation through our actions and our presentations and our thoughts on different topics as it comes to looking at family law and women's rights. Our two speakers, I'll introduce them to you very, very quickly. We have Elizabeth Godbout, who is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work and Criminology at Laval University. She focuses on parental separation, and she looks at parental separation and impacts. We have Catherine Turbide, who did her doctorate in social work from Laval University. She is at the University of Quebec in Rimouski. She was previously a social worker with the youth protection sector and services, and she now works with families benefiting from those types of services. So this webinar is translated. So if you'd like to have access to the French slides, you have to click on the English channel, and then you can also click on the little planet at the bottom of Zoom to have the interpretation in English. So you need to pick interpretation in English and the English channel to have access to the PowerPoint in English, and otherwise you're in the French presentation. We'll take questions at the end, at the end of the presentation. So please don't hesitate to write them in or raise your hand whenever you would like and they come to mind. Have a great presentation. Thank you, Dominic. Catherine and I are very pleased to participate in this webinar today at noon. So for us, it's an opportunity to share the fruits of our thinking and our research. We are two researchers studying parental separations, transitions, family transitions in the broad sense, and our experiences really focus on this phenomenon which separations represent when they are, when we're talking about couples, and often they are full of conflict. And so we have conjugal violence and separation anxiety, and we know that these are challenges in the field and also in research. So we wanted to look at research as well. So why is this such an important topic that we wanted to address today? Well, just to remind you, we know that in conjugal violence, the biggest risks for people's safety are seen around the time of the separation. So when it comes to conjugal violence, we know that separation can cause an increase in violence. There can be an increase in being hurt, and homicides as sexual violence as well. And when separations happen in the context of conjugal violence, there are lots of red flags that come up because safety concerns are huge. Now, we also saw, both in research but in everyday work, newspaper articles presenting the different articles or the different challenges that victims of violence have when it comes to parental separations and children, protection of youth. And so it's tough to recognize violence, and it's tough to get any arrangements in some cases that are safe for women and their children. And so now we have talked a lot about this in the media. In research, we'll raise the different dynamics around research that focus on these different challenges. But after that, it's a question of how do we explain this whole phenomenon? So maybe we have some explanations, and maybe knowledge on conjugal violence has developed over the time. So we have some two different universes that we're dealing with. And when we don't have the same understanding of reality, we have to understand that these two universes are difficult to reconcile. So we will talk about that today as well. In the past 2 years, we saw a lot of different reports, legal decisions, bills that go, around understanding conjugal violence. And then we have separations, and we have some examples that we're going to be able to raise because some of them are pretty strong. Now, modifications to laws around divorce, they've been modified, and we're now focusing more on family violence with a definition and integrated it in this law on divorce, and the inclusion of factors to consider to understand the interests of children, and that is based on family violence principles as well. And so we have a law on divorce. And in Quebec, at the very least, we have the Laurent Commission report. There's a whole paragraph on these challenges that arise. So when it comes to conflicts, separations, family violence, and how to understand the differences between all of this. Now, through all of these approaches, what we have to do is develop research and the focuses of research so that we understand what is actually taking place in the field. So what we're proposing to you today is that we look at the research that happens around parental separations and conjugal violence, so those two sectors. And then we want to look at family protection, but also youth protection. And we can see how these two realities come together when it comes to these services or these groups who work in these two sectors. After that, we'll illustrate the challenges that we as researchers have faced when it comes to these two phenomenons that come together, even in our research on this issue. And we want to present some of our thoughts and then see how we can develop knowledge. So based on research data, it was longitudinal research on separated parents in Quebec, and then another study on the experience of families after separation and families who have been victims of family violence. So when it comes to legal systems and the challenges, we do know that when we look at the research on the presence of conjugal violence and what the Superior Court has decided and what the family justice system has determined as well, there's very little representative data describing what this represents. There's an American study with a fairly large sample size, which shows that about 50% of parents have a fight with regards to custody. And in the last year, many people were subject to conjugal violence. So in Arizona, the study was in Arizona, and many people were able to go or had to go to family mediation following a disagreement around custody. And so that's what we find in that sample. We had 845 couples. And then another study on this same sample shows that amongst these separated couples, 17% talk about severe physical violence involving controlling and coercive behavior. So we know that the phenomenon of violence and even coercive behavior violence, these things are quite present and very representative, very represented in or between couples. In Quebec, on the topic, we don't have a whole lot of data, but a study was done on judicial files given challenges around custody. And it shows that when there is a trial that's coming up and nothing has been solved yet, there's 3 times more allegations of violence than in files where things have been concluded. So we do know that what we see is that the more a situation becomes legal, the more of, allegations come up around conjugal violence. And so these two phenomena are correlated. So the legalization and the type of problem that comes up. The more something is before the courts, the more issues pop up. Now, if we look at research focusing on parental situations, there are about 15 studies that focus on survivors of conjugal violence and sharing parentally. And what research says, and again, I'm generalizing here a little bit with regards to the studies that exist, but basically overall, we see that we have women who don't feel believed or heard, and they could be subject to conjugal violence. There might be a hostile parent towards another one, and that really stops things judiciously, legally. And then in women who've experienced this, they've said that violent acts are not compartmentalized, and so we know that women do experience this, and their trauma is not recognized by the courts either, and so they don't have any specific assistance such that we would offer to victims of criminal violence, where they're separated from their aggressors and that kind of thing. Whereas in family justice system, these considerations are not offered. There's also a number of studies looking at practices around experts and judges, so professionals who do focus on taking care of children in when parents are separating, and then judges who focus on these files. And so there are different ideologies that are in place. And when it comes to studies, from the point of view of survivors, they are all qualifier research studies. And we also have the clinical analysis and types of things like that, and a bit of methodologies that are employed in this type of study. And so what comes out when we look at research results is that attitudes on conjugal violence will have an impact on practices that go over and above other factors, specifically socioeconomic factors or training professionals, and attitudes or beliefs that come from a mother who formulates allegations of violence, so that she can use that in as leverage. All of these things are very important when it comes to decisions that are made within these very complicated contexts. And what we've also observed is that there's a portion of professionals who, or maybe most professionals, but it's hard to say because the studies don't allow us to generalize across the board to all professionals. But what we do see is that within conflict, rather than a power dynamic, we do see differences. And so when we look at the studies that have led to contents of legal cases, so we have fewer of those, but the study size, the sample size is fairly large. But what we've noticed is that files with allegations of family violence are not different from those that don't have family violence when it comes to sharing, potential parental sharing. And in the studies, what we also see is the differences again between criminal violence and conjugal violence. In other words, like we said earlier, there are certain standards in criminal violence that do not extend to family violence. And so the literature confirms the observations that are made in the field.
So if we take a look at all of the studies, what we realize is that the family justice system is not able to screen instances of family violence and to respond to them adequately. So studies tend to show us, well, we're asking the question, why is it that we're not becoming aware of family violence in these files? And we can understand it by taking a look at the goals of the family justice system and the goals of advocacy groups for victims of IPV. And their values, their beliefs are quite in opposition to one another. In the family justice system, it is the fact that the courts have very few resources. They're dealing with many, many families. And the fact that they don't have a long term perspective on family dynamics, well, it means that more pragmatic decisions are taken in terms of the roles of the parents, and decisions are made in a more pragmatic, practical way. What we want to do is destigmatize separation and normalize it. So parents are parents for their whole lives. So we want to focus on the future of the family. And this sometimes doesn't take into consideration power dynamics, which go under the radar in this point of view of the family. And often we take for granted the equality of the sexes. If we take a look at advocacy groups for victims of IPV, well, we see many contrasting things. For example, IPV must be detected, seen as a serious problem, and the safety of victims must be a primary consideration. And perpetrators of violence must be held accountable. It's also necessary to recognize gender inequalities, which goes against the egalitarian views of the family justice system. So this explains a number of problems that we've seen, and if you add this to the inconsistencies that exist already, well, we find ourselves in a system that has many shortcomings in terms of screening and the ability to protect those involved. So now we'll take a look at youth protection, and I'll pass the floor over to my colleague Catherine. Hello everyone, thank you Elizabeth. So Elizabeth discussed issues pertaining family justice, and these things are very much related to issues in child protective services. In Quebec, the director of youth protection can intervene in the case of these types of situation thanks to the Youth Protection Act. And we have very few recent statistics on the scope of this issue. What we know is that there's been a significant increase between 2020 and 2021 of abuse, emotional abuse, as well as psychological abuse in the area of child protective services, and this includes exposure to spousal violence or separation-related conflict. The most recent data that have to do with severe separation issues are from 2016. So these are situations involving exposure to spousal violence, and it's in 51.8% of cases. And then there's also 14.8% of conflict or separation-related conflict. So the issues that we see in youth protection and many actors in the area know that this is the case. The fact is that it's very difficult to share situations regarding separation. So there are issues in acknowledging these two phenomena and knowing what these families are going through is difficult to understand, and I'll get into this a little bit more in detail. There's also some difficulty acknowledging the truth of the situation. Parents find themselves in situations where there are a lot of demands made of them, and so they need to use a great deal of resources, or the government needs to use a great deal of resources in working with these families. It's important to clarify the role of those involved in the system, and sometimes the social workers, for example, don't have the right experience in dealing with custody issues. And some studies show that some social workers have to resolve things that aren't really part of their responsibility. And these details may be very important for parents. And so the role of these workers needs to be clarified. And as Elizabeth just mentioned, there's an issue of reconciling their role, which is to protect the child. And they also need to maintain the links between the child and the parent, which is really at the heart of the intervention. And it is very important in the case of separation or intimate partner violence. These present very serious issues. So I'll pass the floor back to Elizabeth. Well, there are very few studies on the point of view of parents who are being having a follow-up done on them by Child Protective Services. As a result, that is, of separation-related conflict. So these are parents that suffer a great deal. They have concerns for their child. And in terms of the suffering, well, it shows up in studies on parents who are followed up on following instances of separation-related violence and conflict. Parents have the impression that they're not being taken seriously, that they're bothering workers. And some studies have shown the fact that mothers' points of views, well, they find themselves in a paradoxical situation where they're being asked to leave a violence situation of intimate partner violence, but once the separation has happened, it's difficult to maintain links with the person who is seen as their abuser. And this is necessary, however, to protect the link between the child and the parents. Thank you, Elizabeth. So, something that is unsurprising is that we deal with all kinds of issues in this area. And one of them is that these particular people involved in this situation find themselves in a situation where they need to share two phenomena: severe conflict separation, and this severe conflict, separation-related conflict, and is somewhat unclear even in the scientific literature. And it involves a group of phenomena, and there's no consensus on what exactly this severe conflict, a separation conflict, consists of. So here you can see a few things, but you should take into consideration that there's no consensus. So do we need all of these characteristics in order to define this type of conflict? There's no scientific consensus on the subject. That being said, Generally speaking, in scientific the literature, when we talk about this phenomenon, we're talking about problems with relations that are significant between parents, difficulties in terms of co-parenting, and this is can sometimes be impossible. These are parents who tend to repeatedly use the services of the courts. They find themselves before the courts, and they're not able to reach a satisfying agreement, not one that is satisfying for everyone. And these types of severe conflicts are situations which have a significant impact on the child, and they can be observed in the near term, but also in the long term. And this makes it more difficult to assess these situations. These are also conflicts which last a long time, often more than 2 years. That being said, this doesn't mean that it has to be something that goes for longer than 2 years. This is a very complex phenomenon, and it varies a lot in terms of its duration. However, a child who is exposed chronically to this type of phenomenon, well, the research shows that it will have significant consequences. So that's it for that particular subject. And let me just add something. According to studies on the impact of separation among children, it is the factor that has been linked consistently through studies with the ability of the child to cope. So as a researcher and as an expert in the area, this is something that is very much a concern for me, that is to say, the coping ability of the child. And now Catherine will talk about this concept of this severe separation conflict. And this is sort of an umbrella concept. As a result of its somewhat ambiguous nature, well, there are various phenomena that come with it. So Catherine and I have really racked our brains in taking a look at the literature to develop this diagram here, and it's been informed by research. So it's a way of organizing the literature on this subject, and it's quite complicated. So Catherine discussed parents who are often before the courts or are before the courts frequently disputing custody or parenting time. And there's often a conflict in terms of loyalty. This is often observed in this type of situation, especially in situations where parents insult one another in front of the child. And so the child can find themselves really between a rock and a hard place in this type of situation. So this alienation of the parent from the child, well, it can be projected onto a parent, and it may result in the rejection of a parent. But behaviors which we call alienating or insulting, these are things that are observed both when we take a look at the literature on alienation or on this type of separation conflict. And as for spousal violence, well, often we talk about allegations of violence or acts of violence. And sometimes they occur during the time of separation, but there also may be situational examples, and this makes up a component of the conflict, the separation conflict. And sometimes the essence of the problem is, what type of violence are we talking about? What exactly are we talking about? Is it conflict or violence? So this is something that's very important. Spousal violence and parental alienation, these things are very important, practically speaking, because sometimes there are accusations made in order to try to control an ex-spouse. So these are violent dynamics, and they've been mentioned in various pieces of research. So these accusations of alienation are made, and this may result in a child rejecting a parent for no good reason. And so that's a very important dimension. And so parents who want to protect their children are not necessarily going to be alienated, but there's also parents who insult one another, where the victim of spousal violence is insulted. So a person who's a victim of intimate partner violence may feel like they're alienated from their own children as a result of the behavior of the ex-spouse. So there are various ways in which these different phenomena are linked together with one another, and I've just mentioned a few, but you can see how they overlap. So how can we understand all of these things in the area of research? Well, that was the purpose of our work, and it's been done in the form of all the research that we've done. The first piece of research that I'm going to talk about comes out of a broader project, and it involves the longitudinal survey of separated parents and stepfamilies in Quebec, a specialized study on separated parents, and it was led by a multidisciplinary team in the area of social work, for example, the two of us, but also people in the area of demography, law, economics, psychology. And this involves a great deal of community participation, whether it's by various ministries or other organizations. So this is really a partnership. And this is research that involves 3 measure points, 24 months apart. And in one case, we ask children or families who are going through separation, that is to say, parents who have separated over the last 2 years. We use validated measures or measures used in other population-based studies, and the main themes covered are very broad. This is a broad study on separation where we took a look at health, well-being, family and couple relationships quality, the well-being of the child. We also take a look at law and public policy, as well as the use of services, for example, legal services, psychosocial services. So this is a survey that broadly touches upon separation. And so we have a sample of 1,551 separated parents who were recently separated less than 2 years. And there's an equal representation of mothers and fathers in the survey. These are parents who have physical custody of their child or who do not. And the sample is representative of recently separated Quebecois parents. So parents who have at least one child younger than 14 years old. And so this is a representative sample of the reality of the situation in Quebec. So these are the data that we were able to work with. And it was in the area of different themes, including conflict separation. So what is the nature and prevalence of HCS? And we have this representative sample. And so what percentage of the parents are affected by HCS and what components of the conflict are represented? So in the literature, there are 3 dimensions that are clearly identified: significant judicialization or repeated judicialization, difficulty in terms of making decisions about co-parenting. There's also the presence of security issues, simply difficulty sitting down and coming up with an agreement as to how things are going to work with the child, how co-parenting will be organized. So this all has to do with the roles of parents that must continue to be played in spite of the separation. And finally, there's the presence of security issues. So this refers to post-separation violence, but also the use of various services, youth protective services, for example, and this is in the post-separation period. There are also other components in terms of concerns for the child's safety. There are about 20 total variables for these three dimensions, which have been included in a model which seeks to determine whether this whole three-dimension model is consistent with our data. And what we determined is that this three-dimension model, judicialization, co-parenting difficulties, and security issues, these are three dimensions of one thing, which we often refer to as high conflict separation. So there are about 20 variables that make up this model, and this allowed us to confirm that this theoretical model is adequate. And then what we did is, with respect to these three dimensions, we asked ourselves, how do the parents fit into these criteria? Do the parents have a similar profile in terms of these three characteristics, and how is it demonstrated in our sample? So we took a look at all of these factors, for example, judicialization, co-parenting difficulties, and security issues, and here's what we found. So this is the best model that we were able to get. And what we've pointed out is that the majority of parents who get along, who don't end up before the courts often, who are doing co-parenting well, they have very few safety issues, and in terms of safety issues, it's basically at zero. So these are parents that get along, and it's about 29% of parents. And then there's those who make up the category of so-called moderate agreement, and these are recently separated parents. There's also a number of parents in what we call the worrisome zone, and then finally there's the very worrisome zone, 13%. And this is more than one standard deviation above the average in terms of these difficulties. So this is the subgroup that we're really concerned about. And when we take a look in more detail about what this group is like, well, 13% of parents are in this very worrisome category, and of them, 34% have at least one appearance before the Superior Court, 30% have had a decision after a trial. And it's very rare among the other groups to have this type of situation occur. 30% have had a custody assessment on the child's custody, which is very rare among the other groups. 45% are worried about the safety of the child when with the other parent. About a third of them have used youth protection services, and we don't know why. So this is a very broad study on this. And we know that youth protection is often involved, and half of these parents in this group have had some troubles with the police. 10% have used shelters, that is to say, people who are victims of violence, and 34% of them have mentioned that their separation is a result of intimate partner or family violence that has occurred in the past. So the third of these parents mentioned that there has been violence in their situations and that it brought about their separation. So it's quite a concerning picture that's painted of these groups, and what this concerns and what the literature shows is that there are many dimensions that need to be taken into consideration. So we said that perhaps there are parents that have very significant security issues, but who have fewer of the other aspects of this conflict syndrome. And what we realized is that these three issues are very much linked to one another. And this confirms one of our hypotheses, and it confirms the importance of screening. And it also explains the confusion, practically speaking, with respect to these types of situation. So I gave you a short presentation on my analysis of these data. So I've got a colleague who is a professor at another university and who has worked on post-separation violence in the context of this survey. And this is a population-based survey. And so our ability to measure the phenomenon of family violence is not very precise. So we asked some questions on the type of violence that had occurred, whether it's psychological violence through children, physical violence, sexual violence. And these are variables that were taken into consideration. So Miss Perona discovered that about a third of parents said that they had suffered violence, whether it's psychological violence through children, physical violence, or sexual violence since the separation. About a quarter of them are the only victim, and 45% of them are neither perpetrator nor victim of violence following the separation. And whether it was men or women who responded to this survey, well, it doesn't really change the phenomenon in terms of the proportion of those who were the perpetrators or the victims of violence. So it shows that the sample is fairly heterogeneous in terms of this population study. So what was subsequently done is that we wanted to work on a more homogeneous sample. So Miss Perona, what she did was she excluded parents who, despite the fact that they had said that they had been perpetrators or victims of violence, they mentioned in terms of co-parenting that they had a good co-parenting process with their ex-spouses. And so these parents were doing co-parenting well despite the separation. And 20% of the initial parents, so the among the 1,551 parents, well, 20% of them report having suffered or experienced violence and having had a deteriorated post-separation co-parenting. And when we take a look more specifically at this subgroup of parents, we realize that they have different profiles. I'm not going to get into the detail of the results, but when we take a look at the violence that is repeated over time, well, people who said that violence is a reason for their separation and that who used protective services or housing or police services, well, this means that the sample is 39 people and they're almost 100% women. And these are people who experienced violence, which Ocean called violence that was repeated over time. And this is very concerning as a result of the safety issues for these people. So this is what we were able to do in terms of our ability to find this very specific sample where there was violence. But as you know, this involves various types of violence. So in conclusion, I'd like to remind you that there are some problems with using a population study, and sometimes it's difficult to isolate situations of coercive control given the general nature of the data that we used. So I'm going to pass the floor over to Catherine, who's going to speak about another project with respect to youth protection. Thank you. So when we were doing our analyses on this longitudinal study, while my colleagues were analyzing these data, I was working on my thesis, and I was doing more qualitative work on the perspective of the parents. So I was taking a look at parents who were involved in youth separation as a result of this phenomenon of HCS rather. So I decided that I wanted to take a look at the perspective of parents, and I found a few qualitative studies. And this has been my experience as a social worker in the area of youth protective services. There were some qualitative studies which demonstrate that it's important to take into consideration the context in which the conflict arises, or the spousal conflict, or the separation conflict, because these are parents who have a certain distrust toward the other parent. They have concerns about their child, and they're perhaps suspicious of the new spouse of the other parent. There are concerns about the young age of the child, their mental health issues. There are suspicions of violent behavior. There's also reluctance or refusal when it comes to the child. So we see that this is a complicated phenomenon. And so it seems that high conflicts, so to speak. And so what we need to do is to take a look at these things in more detail in order to better understand the phenomenon. And strangely enough, there are many studies on HCS in the area of youth protective services, but the point of view that we had is that the workers of the system, we had a lot of information about them, but we didn't so much have information about the parents. And these parents speak a lot and they ask for a lot. So the goal of my thesis was understanding the journey of families, and from their perspective, I wanted to know what characterizes their journey in terms of their family trajectory, their use of services, and also how does the youth protections intervention fit into their journey. So these are the questions that I asked. And so in order to make this a little bit more understandable, basically what I wanted to know is, why is it that during these conflicts, why is it necessary for youth protective services to intervene? So what I used was this particular model, which I'm not going to explain in detail today. I was able to also use the Johnson model. It was just mentioned. It has to do with intimate violence, or situations where parents dominate one another. There's a sort of terror that is inflicted on one parent by the other. There's also the question of violent resistance, and finally there is situational violence, where there's no type of domination and it's more of a bidirectional phenomenon, and it is associated with HCS. And often we speak about situational violence as something that's less serious than intimate terrorism, for example. And I didn't operate on this principle, because often these acts can be quite severe, and they can be quite different from this intimate terrorism. And if I could go to the next slide, I also use Stark's model, which has to do with intimate terrorism. It has to do with coercion and coercive control. And I won't get into any more detail on that. So that was the theoretical basis that I was operating on. In terms of my methodology, so my approach was qualitative. I was interested in the parents' point of view, and I was interested in their journeys. I did interviews. And let me just explain the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria. My thesis had to do with high conflict separation. So in order to participate in the research, these people needed to be relevant in terms of Section 38C of the Youth Protection Act. The emotional abuse needed to be caused by HCS. I also included other criteria. And I knew that these phenomena were complicated and there were many overlapping factors. So what I wanted was to, uh, of course, I wanted to share information on this phenomenon of post-separation violence. And so I didn't meet with mothers who were victims of violence caused by HCS. So this was an exclusion criterion that we put into place. And the recruitment was done by the workers of Youth Protective Services. And so we wanted people where there was suspicions of spousal violence. Well, we didn't want these families, in fact, to be referred to the study. So I did recruiting with the help of workers at 3 different sites, at 3 locations of Child Protective Services in Quebec. And so workers informed parents of the existence of this study and asked their permission so that I could contact them. So that's basically how I started my research. So this allowed me to meet with 15 women and 6 men who have on average 2 children, and 2 participants, well, there were 2 relationships that were followed with HCS, and it was done in the Bas-Saint-Laurent region, in Chaudière-Appalaches, and in the National Capital region. So 81% of these people work full-time, but 52.3% have an income that is below the Quebec average. So beyond my general research questions, I had more specific ones, and I won't tell you about all of them. What I focused on was 2 specific questions. First of all, what is the nature of the difficulties encountered in their family trajectory? So I was wondering how these difficulties between parents evolved and what contributed to this evolution. And as I said at the beginning, I didn't want to have any situation where there was exposure to spousal violence. But I was obliged to take a look at this question because, in spite of the precautions that were taken, I found myself with a sample. And once the theoretical framework was used, it turned out that there were instances of spousal violence. So my results demonstrate the complex nature of what these families are going through. First of all, there were 11 parents where there was a situation that was more akin to HCS. So there was a mother who said that she was having difficulty with this type of situation, and she said so very directly. So for her, this was a very bidirectional situation, and both parents are adding to the conflict. And among these 11 parents, there were also situations where it goes beyond conflict. There were difficulties in terms of mental health, in terms of drug use. And so, beyond the conflict between the parents, these are also people dealing with various other issues. In the second group, and we're talking about 8 women. So when we take a look at what they had gone through, we realize that it corresponds to post-separation spousal violence with exposure to the child in the context of this post-separation violence. So these are mothers who describe coercive control and who were subject to the domination of their spouse before and after the separation, or perhaps sometimes only afterward. So they may had been concerned about coercive control before and after the separation, and some of them also described a cycle of violence. So, in spite of the precautions, what they said is that this is really not a phenomenon of separation conflict, but spousal violence. There are also four unclear situations. So these are also women who described violence before, during, and after this separation. So for these people, they weren't necessarily attributing these things to the other spouse, but this is not a question of spousal violence. It is a question of mental health or relationship issues between the father and the children. So these are sort of ambiguous situations because it's difficult to classify them uh, like the first two groups. And now, how do their difficulties evolve? Well, there's a first group of parents, it's not only mothers, of parents where there is sort of a snowball effect of difficulties. And today, co parenting is very difficult or even impossible. Thank you. So, for example, a father that is saying that they had so much difficulty with the spouse that the person says, I'm scared and I was obliged to completely cut ties. And there are other people whose conflicts have been going on for some time. And there are other people where the conflict is more focused on the post-separation period. And it may appear strange that if we take a look at their journeys prior to separation, well, it wasn't easy. There were a lot of problems. But these people see this as being normal or not serious. And these are events that happen following the separation. And this means family recomposition or event that happened after separation. And the example given is the arrival of the new spouse, who makes it impossible to move forward. And something I'd like to specify is that sometimes the arrival of a new spouse, it's not always a problem. Sometimes it's the new spouse that resolves the conflict. But in this situation, this is really the reason for the current conflict. I also met with some parents who had a lot of problems, but where the situation has resolved. And sometimes there's some very sad things can happen. For example, in this situation, it is the death of a loved one, and so the problem that existed at the beginning was resolved. All right, you can go to the next slide. So, one other area that I'd like to touch upon, well, we talked about the point of view of workers, of parents, but I was wondering, what are the consequences of the intervention of the youth protective services?
So there are two big dimensions, two directions. Parents will say, well, there isn't much of an improvement between parents, and Child Protective Services doesn't help to improve or improve things. And that allows us to decrease some course of behavior or control, like looking at emails and texts and things like that. And that, a mom, for example, could say, okay, well, the things the reason why things slowed down, well, it's because the child protective services are there, or they're kind of like a watchdog. And they'll also talk about the impact as their role of a parent. And the child protective services allowed them to have access to the child and improve the relationship with the child when the conflict got so bad that it was no longer possible. The child protective services will also work on different parental practices, and moms found that difficult because for them, the problem was not that. The problem was addiction in the other parent, conflict, that sort of thing. So it could be difficult to hear. Well, you're going to have to improve your relationships and your parental practices, you know. And then when it comes to co-parenting, parents said, well, CSAs would work with them. But for some parents, it's difficult to understand, why do we have to create a connection with another parent, the other parent, even though the relationship was so difficult and so challenging the entire time? Why am I doing this now? So what it allows us to determine is that we're talking about basically very different and complex situations. What we need to consider is the history of family challenges. And my study in child protection services, so, I think this statement is particularly interesting in child protection, whether we be at the assessment or the application of measures. And I think what we have to say as well is that it's just as true, no matter what the legal system, these people will come and have a story together, and we're going to have to make best decisions for children and take into consideration the whole. We also want to take into consideration power dynamics in relationships. And for that, we still have a whole lot of work to do to understand intimate partner violence dynamics and how inequalities can sort of integrate themselves daily in people's lives. Now, at the very beginning, Elizabeth mentioned that there's been research on conflicts following a separation, and that's been going on for years, and they work along with IPV studies. And so we do have to look at how things happen. We have to be able to look at our information and theoretically use our approaches. And we need to be able to talk both in research and in the field. Elizabeth, I think I'll turn the floor back over to you. Yeah. So if I can carry on with the findings, well, we know that studies and data show the necessity to have a response that is adapted to a context. We don't want things to be so heterogeneous. So when we look at separation conflicts, that's where we determine that family violence can go under the radar. And that's really important. And so that'll help us understand situations and to provide adaptive answers, whether they be, a question of parental arrangements or ensuring safety in situations, and distinguish the services and offer the right services to the right people. So that's a huge challenge. And that does appear, and it seems to be in our research. So in our research, we do know that sometimes there's confusion when other people get involved and they don't know what the situation is. And so in research, how can we ensure that we make adequate distinctions between various situations? So all of this brings us back to the resources in our system. At the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the legal system. It's hard to do any research and get adapted answers to situations that are essentially psychosocial contexts and situations. And here we see that the open door is the justice system. So that's an important aspect. And it represents all sorts of challenges in a context where there's a lot of pressure on the legal system for Youth and Child Services. Now, I also mentioned that we are currently going in the right direction, but resources need to follow along. So that was part of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And we have time for questions. So we'd be happy to hear from you. We are available to take any of your questions. Please go ahead. Hello, thank you so much for this great presentation. It was very complete and it adequately describes all of the complexities involved in this type of a situation. So that's very interesting. Elizabeth and Catherine, thank you. We have a short period for questions. Don't hesitate. I know that some hands went up during the presentation, so if you have questions now, please don't hesitate to take the floor. You can also send your question to the chat, and at that point, we can ask our speakers. So there we are. Great, thank you very much. I will turn the floor over to you if you have any questions. I see that Mary Ellen raised her hand. Please don't hesitate to take the floor if you have any questions. I'm not hearing anything on my end. Oh, it's because Mary Ellen said she didn't know how to speak. Is somebody able to open up their mic? To turn on their mic? Maybe. Or maybe if they're not able to speak, okay. Then in that point, can you put the question into the chat? Please write your question in the chat. That's our second option. So if you write that into the chat directly, then, or in the Q&A directly, then you can ask your questions. So please go ahead and do that. Perhaps we'll just give you a quick moment to put your questions into the chat. And then we'll read out the questions. Okay, here's the first question. It's great to see data on the issues. What's the follow-up in terms of research and in practice? What is expected as follow-up? So, Catherine, yeah, do we have things to say? Yeah. So I think that what seemed to be the most urgent is to better specify and look at conjugal violence and separation and intimate partner violence. And for me, at the beginning, it's to look at everything that we have to look at. So look at the point of view, the perspective of the different players, so both parents experiencing this, the points of view of the different stakeholders, anybody involved, and those on the front line, and then children. Teens we don't hear from very, very often, younger children. So in my opinion, that's the priority, to better understand the phenomenon and to understand that this could be just the tip of the iceberg. So we need to understand that. So the first aspect is conceptual. The first level is conceptual. And then we have to develop practices that are adapted practices that offer flexibility and allow us to work with stakeholders in youth protection And I know that there are lots of institutions working to create different ties. And so there is something to look at there. It's a good idea to look at those tools that are created and that are adapted to the different contexts and different milieus. And so we do have to be able to put forth research in all sectors, in all directions at the same time. Great, thank you. That's a great answer, practically speaking. For me, I work in the legal field and in family rights. And so I work with family mediation, but I also work before the courts, the Superior Court, so that we understand all the situations. I did mention that that could be the open door for a number of families. Their situation becomes legalized. After that, there are services offered. Now, we don't have a triage system for files, so often we find ourselves in a situation which brings us always to the same answers. And what's valued is that parents parents agree, and that they be able to manage things beyond the legal context. And that's not always easy because there's a power dynamic. And so offering appropriate services in a triage system for all files, I think that would be something that could be developed and that would be really important to develop, as a matter of fact. Then there are questions of, we have some questions that came up in 1974, for example, and we're still waiting on answers. But basically in Quebec, we've looked to grouping together situations around youth protection and conflict, and parental dynamics. So we want to help parents save time and energy. And so basically, it's another situation that's quite important. Now, when research continues and when we try to do what we're trying to do, Catherine and I, it is important to look at separation challenges, severe conflict, conjugal violence, and to use this context of separation in conjugal violence. And we don't have good definitions, legally speaking. So basically, there are a lot of things that need to be illustrated there, specifically the development of getting out of a conflict situation. And that's something that we are looking to work on. I've got longitudinal data. I'm working on this with my colleagues. I'd like to continue to look at the evolution of that. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, thank you. I've got two other questions that have come in English, but I'll try to translate them in French. So Joel says, in his experience before the court, so 35 times in 4 years, judges were not aware, well, didn't seem to take into consideration the fact that there was intimate partner violence and said that it was severe conflict. And so, how do we train judges so that they take into consideration the fact that it's not just severe conflict, but in fact, domestic violence? And so, how do judges experience that and understand that? So, this is a survivor and a self rep who has said this. Okay, well, that's a big question, and it's really important. So, we have the CARA law, and it's being studied by the Senate right now. And the idea is to train judges around this issue. So we'll have to wait for the follow-up of this bill for judge training. And then we also know that laws on divorce have changed. In Quebec, civil law has changed as well when it comes to addressing children. And so things have changed. We do have to look at violence so that we understand the child's best interest. So we know that there is a change in mentality that comes along very, very slowly. There's a lot of paradigm shifting that needs to happen when it comes to intimate partner violence and when it comes to conjugal violence and the legal system. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to do to undo myths around IPV. Okay, I've got more questions, so I'll carry on. I've got four questions that have come up. 4 or 5 anyway. So the first question is, why expose parents to this paradoxical situation that you're describing when a parent tries to cut off ties with another one, specifically an intimate partner in violence context? Why does the decision come up that the relationship between parents and children needs to continue, and why continue to subject women to violence, domestic violence? Would you like me to jump in here? Yeah, I think we'll complete this one. Okay, well, basically, I think there's a few reasons that explain that this is paradoxical. First of all, in family violence, there's a challenge around detecting. So, because of the complexity of challenges, and there's also a challenge where we are in a society where we try to keep the connection up between children and their parents, both parents. We try to hold on to that. And in most situations, that should be the case. However, there are violent situations post separation where that idea needs to be examined closely and thought about and assessed to avoid children going into situations that are full of violence, and then where some people feel like they're stuck in violence, and the system is perpetuating that violence rather than eradicating it or helping. Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to complete? No, I think your answer was a good one. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, great. Thank you. So here's another question in English. So I'm translating. So, how do you show coercive control of children, teenagers drawn into loyalty battles being manipulated by perpetuator against safe parent? I'm not sure I understand the question. Well, let me start again. Okay, so what do we do, or how do you show coercive control of children and teenagers who are drawn into loyalty battles and are being manipulated by the perpetuator against the safe parent? So that's the question. Okay. So that's like parental alienation, right? Yeah, what I'm understanding is that it's the perpetuator of the violence, the perpetrator, who is pitting the children against the safe parent. So essentially, and the safe parent is also a victim of conjugal violence. Okay, so here I think we might be referring. I guess it's a question around what we do in this type of situation, right? So when it comes to parental alienation, there are tools that could be used, and it would be a question of correcting the situation when one parent is pitted against the other. So that's the first thing. And there are all sorts of tools that have been developed. They're not all nicely supported by research, unfortunately, when it comes to, undoing brainwashing in children. So that type of situation. And then when it comes to parental alienation, in one of my bits of research, I had a situation like this. And in the end, this person found themselves, it was a young person who was a victim of parental alienation. And her mother, who had rejected her, was also a victim of conjugal violence. And at some point, when she wanted to leave the parent, the alienated parent, she found herself in a situation of violence as well because she wanted to leave the other parent. And so we can see how all of this can happen. And you've got a parent who wants to get out of a violent situation and who starts to apply violence. So it's very security and safety. I'm alarmed for the safety of young people experiencing these situations, because when it's time to leave a parent who's got a lot of control, it can come back in their face. In research, we've seen that before. So it's physical violence applied by the parent. So that's an answer, but I don't have all the answers. And there are ways of intervening so that we can see, you can create a positive image of the parent rejected as well. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I still have a couple of questions here. It's good. It's starting a lot of interest. So that's good. Now, with regards to the justice system and co-parenting, understanding that is the reality of violent situations and post-separation, will that ever be addressed? That's a good question. That's a concern because general services offered to parents on the broad scale are really tainted by this vision of favoring co-parenting, which is good for all parents, all families, and generally speaking, in general, it's very good. But sometimes there are specific challenges, and then we need something much more in place, much more defined. And so parents who are experiencing violence, they're going to have other situations around violence, and they might have safety situations in their own context that are problematic as well. So it's hard to offer adapted responses, and it brings me back to the superior court approach of the triage. Okay, and just a quick comment. Again, Christine Lafontaine, we'd like to thank, and Isabelle Côté and Simon Lapierre, thank you for your work as well. Thank you to all of the other people involved who are changing violence against women and children. So I'm going to carry on because we've got a couple of other little questions, short questions. We have another question here. I'm doing them in order. So what's the validity of the idea of violence perpetuated by the system that somebody could be a good parent and a perpetrator as well? Okay, so what do we do about that type of situation? Yes, exactly. So this is a received idea. It's very broad. I have enough experience. I've done conferences with lawyers and judges, and this is something that I have heard a lot in the comments. In the comments, it's the idea that things are challenging. This said, I'd like to mention that the Supreme Court of Quebec last year validated this, that a parent could have intact parental competencies and be violent. This is something that was validated by the Supreme Court recently. What's the impact of that then? When we look at some files, well, that is something that needs to be followed. Okay, great, thank you. I have another comment from Sarah Chamberlain, who says, thank you for the presentation. With the implementation of specialized tribunals in Quebec, are you presenting your research to various law professions, legal professions? Well, for me, I'm quite active around the Superior Court and less for criminal and penal court. I have less access to some networks, and it could be really great to join other networks so that we could present our research and our data, because indeed, these are challenges that we see around severe conflict in situations of separation. And for me, I'm more with judges working in youth protection, and we talk and we present data and we share information. So, but it's less criminal than family. Okay, great, thank you. All right, I've seen a couple of questions. They continue to come in. We have another 5 minutes, and so let's take as many as we can. So we have a comment. So violence, unfortunately, despite our services, there's still violence. I'm looking for change. And then here's a new question. Okay, what do we do to undo the brainwashing in teenagers? Oh, what a big question. Indeed. I don't have a whole lot of documentation on this, but what people are saying is that the people working with teens say that it's difficult because we're trying to create a connection between teens and adults. But teenagers want to become more independent. So that adds to the challenge because we have to undo negative ideas from one parent and rebuild connections with the other parent. So it's actually easier to work with younger children, from what I've heard, on these issues. I think in a certain proportion of situations after teenagehood, when kids are adults, then they can understand better and change their minds. And then they can rebuild links. Unfortunately, sometimes the relationship is irreparable, but if it can be reparable, then that's a good idea. So that's my answer. But there aren't a whole lot of services developed for that type of situation. Can I add two comments to that? And I think what you said at the end, Elizabeth, is really important. I'm finishing research on young teens or young adults, 18 to 25-year-olds who were exposed to conjugal violence when they were younger, and they do their own work. Yes. And they make decisions as young adults. They decide who they want to continue to connect with or not. Unfortunately, what they expressed when they were children, they weren't heard as young people and teenagers. And they also, somebody else said that the system causes violence when we're not able to listen. But I would maybe reformulate the question. So, how to undo brainwashing? Well, how do you recognize these young people as victims of violence themselves? So, when there are emergency protocols in place, safety in place for the victim of violence, the adult, then why not do the same thing for a teenager who's stuck in this oppressive situation? We have to look to parents and everybody involved, and the child needs to be at the center, at the heart. And so, how do we help women who are victims of violence? There are crisis cells across the province, and so these should be available to young adults as well. Great, thank you. Thank you for that. That's really, really true. Thank you for that intervention, that comment. And thank you to all of you. I think this webinar was extremely interesting. I'm not seeing any other questions, and we're getting to the end of our time in any case. So if there's anything, please don't hesitate to ask me. We'd be happy to send out answers to questions that come in following this. It's a really complex subject. We've we've looked at it under different angles. And yeah, it's a really interesting subject. Thank you to all of those who were present here today and the speakers. Thank you to all of you. For all of the people present here, I'm going to give you a link so that you can assess the presentation. So the link's in the chat. You can click on the link so that you can assess the presentation. Christine Lafontaine, thank you for your contribution. It's been very appreciated. So thank you. Thank you to all of you, and please don't hesitate to connect with us again at a later date and time if you have any other questions. Okay? And you can contact our speakers as well. And don't hesitate to fill out the evaluation link, please. That'll really help us. Have a great week with a little bit of sun. This last week will be sunny, so take full advantage of it. Thank you very much to all. Goodbye.